Hey there, listeners. A quick note before we jump into the episode with Ian McKenzie. I am in the middle of a Kickstarter campaign with my book, Hiding Inside a Man. And this book is so meaningful to me. The subtitle is Finding Strength in Self-Compassion, and it comes from a part of me that honors that I am a sensitive man and the ways in which I have moved through my relationship to even confusion being a man in today's world and some of the healing I've experienced around that. It is very autobiographical. It is full of my own illustrations. I invite you to go check it out. It's at Kickstarter. Look up Hiding Inside a Man by Matthew Sloan. And I hope you resonate with something there. And if you do, I hope you also are willing to share it. Check out the videos. They'll give you a little tip on what I mean by the kind of spirit of sharing that I hope you engage in, because there's a lot of shaming of men happening now that, while I understand there are challenges, I really hope we can go to men with an open heart and invite them into more of being themselves rather than playing the game that we taught them in the first place. Thank you so much. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to Fatherhood Dojo, and welcome to my guest, Ian McKenzie. Hey, Ian.
Hey, Matthew. Good to be here.
Yeah, good to have you. Ian and I know each other from being in father's circles before. I'll put more about Ian in a bio section in the notes, but I've really enjoyed following your path, Ian, both as a creator and a speaker and a writer. And maybe just to get started, I'm going to ask you the question I've heard you ask a lot of your guests in your show, The Mythic Masculine, which is, in order to land in this space, what could you say about where you're located, physically, spiritually, or otherwise?
Good question. I'm open source, so I'm happy that you're playing this here. Right now, I'm in the side room of my partner's bedroom here at our home, which we've just moved to actually last month. Up until then, we were actually they were living within a community close by. It's still close by, but we were on the property, but now we're about 10 minutes away. And a bunch of reasons for that. There was a bit of a shuffle in ownership and structure. And also for my partner and I and our son, who's now almost 6, we had this recognition that for our entire relationship, we've been part of community, like literally since the beginning. And actually one of the reasons why I said yes to having a child, or like I hadn't really had a strong impulse, was because I was feeling this emergent co-creation with others in community. And so I felt like, oh, wow, this is it. This is what I was seeking and feels like the right vessel in order to bring a child in. And my partner felt somewhat the same around seeking community as well. And so that was one of the reasons we said yes. So we've been part of community projects the last, almost 6 years. And somewhat recently it became to light that, like, you know what? Community is hard work, actually. And it might be nice just to chill out a little and in some ways go nuclear for a bit. And so that's what we did. And again, we're very close to the community. We're still embedded and woven into comings and goings and doings. But it does actually feel nice and simple to feel just the 3 of us in our little family pod. So that's part of what's present for me. It's raining now, the summer is waning clearly in this time of the season. And at the same time, it's nice to be here on a late Friday, end of the week, and have a good conversation with a longtime friend.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Yeah, and I'll just say to get myself present too, I'm sitting in my backyard office in the Portland, Oregon area, and really happy that it's Friday and happy to have my daughter's birthday is tomorrow. She's turning 8, and we have made full use of that event as a deadline for getting all sorts of things done around the house. It's been really great to have that kind of shared flow with my wife where we're both like, okay, all these physical things need to change, and we're going to use this opportunity to like get it done by this date. So that feels great. And otherwise located, this may be a kind of a part of a tee up to this conversation. Located in me is this ongoing wondering about my relationship to control. And so in daily life, with my kids especially, and then at work in all sorts of settings, the degree to which I am actually in control or not, the degree to which I exert control or not. Yeah, I'm just in a big inquiry about that. So Let me say a little bit about this topic and why I'm happy to be talking to you about it, Ian. We're calling this fatherhood and monster empathy. I had written some articles a little way back this year in which I was exploring that paradox for me between the understanding of a monster archetype and the understanding of the difference between revenge and reconciliation, and then facing the reality of day to day and my actual responses as a father with my kids. My kids are age 8 and 4. And I've had this interesting feeling of those are different things. There's this high level understanding that feels beautiful to be in. And then there's the day to day reality where there isn't quite an integration yet. There's a longing for the things that I know to be my behavior in these harder moments. And my intention for this conversation, Ian, is to invite both of us to play a dance between what we feel we understand conceptually and then also what's actually happening right now, as candidly as we feel we can share. And I know that you had written some pieces in the past. You wrote about evil, and something about that really picked up on, and you've had some guests on your show. And there has been this conversation I've heard on your end about a similar thing, moving from kind of revenge to reconciliation or something along those lines. Maybe you could just share a little bit about what your experience has been, either in some of those conversations or that article about evil, what you feel you were exploring there as we start to wonder about this together.
Hmm. Well, that piece that you're referring to, the essay, was spurred by The Last Jedi, right? Of course, I don't know what number it was in the sequence, maybe film 8 or 7, maybe. But it was interesting because that film really showed to me, it depicted, I don't know if this was on the surface, really, like the writers necessarily knew this, but I'm always curious to read media from the perspective of what is the intention of the writers or the director or the storytellers? Like, what did they mean when they put these stories together? And then
Mhm.
what are the undercurrents that maybe they didn't know were also transmitted right in the deeper layer? And I also tend to wonder again, who was the one therefore that came through in that deeper transmission, right? Who was the
Mm.
author of that? And I use that as an example of, Avatar, for example, could be another example where, of course,
Mhm.
James Cameron had a certain intent and somewhat naked intent to kind of depict this battle between indigenosity in a way and civilization. And of course, it was clear who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. And just to use that example, that at the end of that film, the first one, and I did see the second one, and again, I was a bit dismayed that it was essentially the first film again. It felt like,
Mhm.
uh, but the first film, it sort of ended, of course, with the colonizers, would-be colonizers, getting kicked off Pandora. And
Mhm.
for a moment, I kind of reprieve, right? A sense of, oh, everything's okay for a time.
Yeah.
And of course, what happens is when there's a defeat, the defeated often gather strength and come back for round two in this case.
Mhm.
But there was a real opportunity there, I think, to invoke or display a kind of a deeper kind of reconciliation between these opposing forces, where the aggressors in this case could have been welcomed into that indigenosity, like that
Yeah.
reality of that indigenousness had granted the inhabitants of Pandora, which was their home, and the capacity to actually be there instead of plunder. No, I'm not saying that's at all accessible or even um, desired by indigenous folks en masse in this case, of course, as a
Mhm.
thinly veiled metaphor for the exact colonizing forces and the indigenous folks and peoples that continually resist them. I'm not saying that necessarily, but that there is a kind of what's beyond good and evil
Yeah.
question, right? Because, and that was up also in the Last Jedi because of this. Very much so, that is a story depicted of this, ultimate and ongoing battle between good and evil. And I thought there was a really interesting part in that movie when, if I recall correctly, what's his fellow, the evil character? I can't remember his name now, even, but of course he offers the opportunity to Rhea or Ray, I think, right, the good Jedi, to like step out of the cycle of good and evil and like join her.
Mhm.
and not to perpetuate endless war. And in some ways, it feels like a bit of a seduction into join me on the dark side kind of thing. But there was a deeper something there. I think it was an invitation to break the cycle of that winner and loser,
Mhm.
for good.
You're talking about
And
Kylo
so
Ren?
anyway, that's right. Yeah, Kylo Ren.
Yeah.
And so it was just interesting to me to wonder about that and I don't think that necessarily was what the writers were saying or getting at in a way, because it's easier to read it as like, well, he was just trying to seduce her to join him on the dark side.
Mhm.
But I use that to wonder even further. And writers like Charles Eisenstein have written about this extensively, right? This idea of stepping out of war culture or like war
Mhm.
mind, right? Where there is an other, and then as soon as you other some other, then you can go to war against them. But the seeds of the repercussions and ongoing, win and lose are built into that whole model.
Mhm.
And so I followed that down to even look at, well, what is the nature of evil? And, when I looked in the etymology a bit further, what I seemed to find was that the deeper meaning of evil, before it became a kind of moralistic sort of designation, right, by the church, primarily by the Christian perspective, that turned it into a moral thing, right? It's like you're on the side of good or you're on the side of evil. I would almost call it maybe an indigenous understanding of evil from an older perspective was the unwillingness to abide by limitation.
Mhm.
Like that became that was what was initially understood as evil. And that to me felt significant, because when you look at the empire and the whole impulse to plunder and take and,
Mhm.
go to war, whenever that impulse arises itself, when you go beyond the natural limits that a place is able to hold, a people, the resources of the place, whenever that's overrun, and all of a sudden it starts a chain reaction of the need for more, and okay, now we'll take this guy's territory, and then that's what evil
Mhm.
seemed to meant before the moralistic lens got put on top of it.
Mhm.
And so there's more to chase down there, but I just thought that was fascinating to wonder about in that piece. And again, it goes back to this theme that I think we're circling around here, which is around monster. And oftentimes, of course, it's the monster, however they're depicted in a narrative or in a encounter, that is seen as the other, right?
Yeah.
And the one that is enacting or acting in ways that are destructive or objectifying or violent and the rest.
Mhm.
And so it's very easy to say, okay, well then we have to, destroy the other or neutralize in some fashion, and then everything
Mhm.
go back to being great again.
Yeah.
But reality is a little more complex than that often, and I'm sure we'll get into more of that here.
Yeah. Good. Thank you for that. I'm going to read one or two quotes from that article to layer in this a bit. You had said, and this kind of related to finite and infinite games, you said attempting to eliminate evil in service to the good is how evil is enacted in the world. And then
Mhm.
evil is the attempt to collapse all games, both infinite and finite, into one finite game. That's where the part of me that thinks about control really pricked up, because I could feel that in
Mm.
myself. Like, oh, yeah, wouldn't it be wonderful if I could have full control over my kids? And that's part of this conversation, too, when you said, if the monster is being destructive. And immediately I thought of my 4-year-old in our living room and his impulses. Um, Maybe you could say a little bit about your family structure and the child in your life.
Sure. Well, so my partner and I, we share he's almost 6 now. His birthday's in just under a month from this recording in mid-September. And yeah, I mean, like I said, we've lived in community for the full, basically the fullness of that time. So that means we've actually been around a fair amount of children, actually, which is great to for him to have those interactions and um, bounce off them and hone himself and learn relationality. And also, he's been part of the Waldorf school the last
Mm.
2 years, and he's just started his second round of kindergarten because he's a bit later birthday, so we wanted to give him an extra round.
Yeah.
Um, so our primary pod is the two of us, my
Yeah.
partner and I, and our son. And
Okay.
yeah, I'd say the dynamics at play seem very familiar, of course, that you've named. Um, I sometimes have referred to him and other young children in this regard as, um, what is it? Demons of disorder,
Yeah.
or the other one is angels of entropy. Because,
Yeah.
they're just so sweet. And yet, set them loose in a room and,
Yeah.
watch out for, to 5 minutes later. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Maybe you could share a little bit if we make this more personal as fathers. What do you notice going on in yourself? And I'm going to make an assumption. I won't say it true for me. You can say what's true for you. I've grown up as a gentle soul, as a nice guy. And whenever I'm encountering chaos that I'm not in favor of, it triggers anger in me. And then I become less reasonable and desiring control. So I've spoken a lot about that on this podcast before. My challenges with rage and anger, just even accepting that they exist in me as a human being.
Mm.
What is your experience like when you come across some of these angels of entropy, in your best moments and your worst moments? Like, what is the spectrum you find yourself inhabiting?
Hmm. Oh, yeah. Well, it's one of those things. I mean, you'd think, or somebody who like myself, maybe you, who's done what seems to be a fair amount of personal work,
Mhm.
self work, feels like, oh yeah, I got this,
Right.
under control,
Mhm.
myself and my world. And then, you encounter a young being who, creates massive sleep deprivation, or, their dysregulation massively dysregulates me often. And just, yeah, pushes you to the edge. I mean, that edge is well known, I think, with parents, and actually not understood well by non-parents,
Mhm.
right? That's one of the things that I think is true as well, is that, if you don't just have to be a biological parent of a kid, but if you don't really have young kids in your orbit very much, then you just do not get it.
Yeah.
Like, it's just clear. That's my friend that said, he has 2 kids, and he's like, there's 2 people in the world, those who get it and those who don't, around kids. Uh, and so it's just, you're in a certain club of like,
Yeah.
yep, that's it. That's the mayhem that you have to deal with, ongoingly, particularly in these
Mhm.
younger years. And then, I've talked to older parents, and it changes right into other things, and teens and beyond. Of course, other kinds of challenges develop. But
Yeah.
as far as this stage, it seems to be often that, yeah, there's this, um, necessity to be with, yeah, heavy dysregulation. I mean, for my son, I would say more recently, and this is something with maybe the mercy of memory, is that you kind of forget stuff that's like earlier,
Mhm.
right? Because you're kind of dealing with what's in front of you. And I'd say for me now, the edge with, my son is, he likes to wrestle a lot now,
Mhm.
right? Like, I feel like there's a lot of, I mean, I've read something about the hormones around that, testosterone surges and things like that.
Yeah.
Um, and so he's very physical these days. Like, he'll show a kind of like, I don't know, excitement, as well as pay attention to me, is like, come and like smack you,
Yeah.
or smack me, or like smack my butt, or
Mhm.
just come and like bite my arm or something, right? And these kinds of, intense encounters,
Yeah.
have created a sense of an aura. And for my partner as well, he'll come and just like grab her boobs or something, right? Like, this, it feels in many ways like this, like a kind of toxic masculinity, like in
Right.
youth form. Right. And I get, for him, his perspective, like, there is a sense of just innocence in a way. Like,
Yeah.
there's just energy that wants to move, and like, it has to move like this.
Yeah.
And so I'm really with this question for me too, which is, I teach and facilitate men's spaces. In particular, a lot of it is cultivating what we, speak of in this realm, drawing from the work of Robert Bly and Iron John, like the wild man, right, is this primordial archetypal figure.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me that, on the one hand, I'm like teaching with men, like, how to access the
Mhm.
wild man. And then here I have this like wild boy, and how am I treating him? Right. Am
Yep.
I like, no, don't do that. Like, don't be wild. But, talk to your therapist, counselor, coach, when you're 35. Then you can try to fix what is being shunned and repressed right now, by your dad. Right. So
Yeah.
obviously kind of aware of that. I'm like, wait a second, I got to make sure I do this right. And so, just even yesterday, we had a conversation, my partner and I, when he came over, and again, I was chatting with her about something, and he just came over and like smacked me and tried to pull my pants down or something, right? And I was like,
Yeah.
whoa, whoa, whoa. And I initially grabbed him, not hard, but just
Yeah.
firmly. And I was like, whoa, son, like, we have to talk about this. And he quickly was like, that's, fought it and like ran away. And my partner's like, okay, like don't scare him. And I was like, I'm not scaring him. I'm just trying to be very clear with him. And so we ended up having to go, we went to his room, which is down the hall, and waited till he was a little more regulated.
Hmm.
Because I also understand, right? It's not helpful to try to teach a child when they're dysregulated
Yeah.
because they're just it's not gonna retain it. But when he was more grounded, we could sit and talk with him and say, hey, son, hey, I understand you're really excited. You want to connect, you want to wrestle, but like just hitting us out of nowhere, and if it doesn't, we don't feel comfortable around you. Like it feels like we have to protect ourselves from you, and we don't want to feel that
Mm.
way. Like I want to feel open and trusting with you. And what are some other ways that you could express that you want physical touch or contact?
Mhm.
And he was like, yeah, okay, I can see that. And maybe the light went on a bit. So basically, yeah, we were trying to empower him, not shame him,
Yeah.
but also how do you create limits, right? As well, because I've also heard that particularly for young boys, well, boys growing up, it's the absence of a father figure which often determines, right, their rate of delinquency, their own sense of discipline,
Yeah.
um, their substance abuse, right? So it's like there's something around the absence of fathering, and
Mhm.
fathering as it's interesting, right? The conundrum, because I've also heard fathering is about inviting the younger boys, and maybe girls too, but boys into like beyond their limits,
Mhm.
right? Like inviting, I mean, into nature. Or I'm thinking of, like going on a big hike or something. Like there's
Yeah.
something around fathering that's actually like encouraging them to go beyond limits, but also
Mhm.
containment,
Yeah.
right? And to actually show when behavior is actually not okay, right? Like
Mhm.
that actually has to, I feel, also has to be there,
Yeah.
because I see how he's treating my partner, like his mother, in ways that I don't want that to feel like be normalized, right? This kind of
Yeah.
entitled, grabby or like, aggressive behavior, but not shame it, but redirect it, so it's a
Yeah.
tricky thing.
Yeah. One of the pieces of advice my wife and I got from a counselor once, she was like, around dinner time, I want you to go outside and jump on the trampoline as a family. And at the least, I want you to witness them. They are looking for you to witness them in their crazy energy and not react. And, this is a practice that's worth trying. We've tried. And it reminds me of wrestling with my kids too, like, to the degree that my son is usually the one who wants to wrestle also. And it's a wonderful way to say yes to a kind of energy that otherwise is really hard for me. Um,
Yeah.
if it's wild boy energy at this stage. And I kind of want to wonder with you, Ian, about this, the parts of us that say no to that. I want to inquire about where that comes from, and it may just be like us. And then there's probably a certain amount of cultural influence, in the stories that we digested. And I've thoughts about that, but maybe you can start us off with, what is it in you believe that causes that initial impulse to push back, repress, uh, put this wild boy in a cage?
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe the first layer is more like consent,
Mhm.
right? And I know I mean, it's tough to get consent from a 5-year-old, perhaps, but if something feels non-consensual, like you just coming up and like swatting me and like, come on, let's play,
Mhm.
so of course I'm going to react a bit. I feel and be like, whoa, 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 buddy. And that's one strategy to try to get connection. I can see on his part. So for me, it's a bit of there's a sense of needing consent, but like in general, but also in this case, yeah, I have to like override that a bit, or like look beyond it and be like, okay, wait, I'm not expecting that from him.
Mhm.
But also I think I would say, yeah, there's a sense that play needs to be, I don't know, structured or something, right? Like, which is again a kind of consequence of an overstructured life,
Mhm.
right? That play needs to be from 2 to 2:30 on Thursdays, like not
Mhm.
just whenever. I'm saying in my own life, right? Like I
Yeah.
find it's far too easy to be bound to this highly structured life, and between work times and da da da. And so again, going back to the infinite game structure, that play inherently is for its own sake, right? True play doesn't have a goal. I mean, you might have a game that has a goal, but play itself, right, is infinitely um, giving in a sense, or nourishing. And that actually takes work, like a lot of adults too. And I would say even myself, like you have to kind of get there, right? Out
Mhm.
of the mindset of when you enter play, if you don't do it very often, you kind of have to get out of the mindset of like that there's an end goal, right?
Hmm.
And actually just release into, wait a second, no, this is just play for play's sake. I mean, kids are great for that, right? Because they invite you into their world,
Yeah.
and that's so much a part of it. Often is that it's just what's happening right now.
Yeah. Timeless.
It's not like, yeah, and what's the goal? You wouldn't say, hey, so what's the end goal of this play session right now?
Okay.
You're like,
Yeah.
what? It's just to play. So I think yes, there's a lot of conditioning to to get through in order to drop fully into these spaces of
Yeah.
unstructured, um, non teleological sense of play,
Hmm.
right? Yeah, but when we get there and it is there, it's like, oh yeah, this is fantastic, and
Yeah.
so it's good to remind myself of that.
Hmm. I want to bring in Moana is a movie that you first introduced to me through your writing. And when
Mm,
I saw the movie, that movie really shifted something for me. And it kind of opened up like where stories can come into play to serve ideas like restorative justice. And I'm not a
mm,
restorative justice expert. I just happen to see that overlay there. One of the things I did, Ian, was interesting. I was like, I started to see these like spectrums when I looked at stories that I've been ingesting. So one spectrum, if we look at a monster type movie, would be like there's actual evidence of violence, and then it's just like assumed or a theoretical threat. So Moana, there's actually violence from the main monster, and the another that's more like perception is like Edward Scissorhands. This guy comes out to the community with Scissorhands. Like some people are really freaked out, but he's not actually doing anything wrong. Then the other spectrum might be like the leader, the protagonist figure that's in support of the monster. Is
mm,
there gender of a female or a male involved? And that's where I started noticing other patterns like um, Moana, the female leader, Edward Scissorhands, also a female. Then there are like, I thought E.T. was a good example of a movie where there's a perception of danger and a male leader asking the community to love this creature from another world. And I had a harder time
mm,
finding examples where there was evidence of violence and a male leader coming in to be restorative.
mhm.
And that's if I think of all the stories that have imprinted on me, yeah.
I mean, it's funny when you said that though, because the one that came to mind actually was for me. Maybe it fits the model. Is
Yeah.
Ernest Scared Stupid? Did you ever see that?
I didn't see that. Tell me about it.
Some folks might remember fellow Ernest P. Worrell, who I can't remember the actor's name now, but yeah, it's just he kind of plays this goofy everyman, and he's in a number of Ernest goes to Africa, Ernest goes to jail. Like there's all these formula, right? But there's one called
Yeah.
Ernest Scared Stupid, and I watched that actually on Halloween again a couple of years ago. And basically, the premise of that is there's this troll that gets kind of released from his prison, in this tree that 100 years prior, like his ancestor, bound him up in this curse, really, or in this prison, to never to be released. So the troll gets released because some things happen. But it's really interesting because the outcome, and I'll just spoil it for anybody, but
Yeah.
the outcome is the recognition. Ernest kind of discovers that the beast can only be not cured in a way, but or vanquished by pure love. It's really interesting, but pure love.
Hmm.
But what is the representation of pure love? And it's funny he kind of like uncovers this scroll or something that it says the words M-I space. It's like a lacuna, so you can't see it. M-I
Uh-huh.
space K, right? And it's so funny because of course he translates. He's like, I know what it is, and he's like Miak, like some other stuff. It's like this must be it. It's Miak, good old fashioned Miak, and we're like, what? Anyway, so it's milk, right? It's
Mm.
milk is the purest representation of a mother's love for her
Mhm.
child, which is really interesting. And so anyway, he feeds the milk to the troll and ends up actually kissing it or something, like offering it motherly love.
Mhm.
And it kind of like it vanquishes the troll because he can't handle the quality of that love.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, I just thought it was really interesting hearing what you were saying around having so there is violence, like he is trapping children,
Yeah.
this troll, and yet it's mother's love actually offered by this kind of
Ernest.
foolish everyman masculine figure
Yeah.
that actually vanquishes the monster.
Interesting. So, and in this case, is the monster brought back into the community in some way? Like, is he transformed or is he like exited?
I just have a feeling I'm trying to recall now. I think he just sort of turns into goo, something
Okay.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
A
Well,
bit
yeah,
like Wicked Witch of the
metaphorically,
West, kind of like, yeah, like kind of, the water turns it into, dissolves into
you're right.
nothing.
Uh, yeah. So metaphorically, we could say like that love vanquished. It's interesting because we think of like a story could be one person and all their parts, or the story could be kind of guidance as to how to be with other human beings, and both can be true. Um, in this case, I could imagine like that's a telling story for a father and a 4-year-old son, for example, to be like, oh, actually, this is a moment to bring love, and the monster aspect of this human being in front of me will be melted, and then the rest of the human being still remains, so they're not being vanquished necessarily.
Totally.
I
Yeah.
love that you brought up Ernest. So I'm gonna finish the thread, and then I want to see what more you want to make of this. So thoughts about that, like the fool character, the archetype of the fool
Mm,
might be a wonderful gateway in some ways.
mm,
And when at least I look at my history, which is, limited to my experience of stories that I remember taking in, it's hard for me to think of moments where a male figure addressed actual violence with a restorative quality. So
mhm.
whether or not that's true, it's just that I'm not able to recollect that. So yeah, anything more for you about those spectrums that you notice in hearing them, or just other stories to bring in?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's worth saying, I mean, again, going back to the Moana example, because I referenced it in my essay, that what is the way to resolution or reintegration, right?
Mm,
Because that's telling. Because I think a lot of the masculine hero structures, it's all about defeating the enemy,
mhm,
usually through another example of domination, right? So I like to use the lens of Riane Eisler, who first put it forth, I think, in Chalice and the Blade. But she differentiates this idea of, she doesn't like to use the word patriarchy because, again, it kind of throws fatherhood under the bus
yeah.
often, and kind of invokes a lot of pushback from, what are you saying? Father is not good. Um, as opposed to, she uses the word androcracy to
Mhm,
mean the rule of man, right? And I don't know. I just think that's helpful actually to add a bit of nuance, because that's an example of what she says is domination culture,
mhm,
right, versus partnership culture. And so, with as many examples of domination culture throughout history and a few examples of partnership culture, but I would say, I don't want to paint any sort of broad brush, but indigenous culture generally seems to operate under partnership model,
mhm,
which is where power moves very differently, right? You have to move through relationality. And I know I spoke about this recently in my webinar around mythopoetic masculinity, but there's a quote from Pat McCabe, Indigenous grandmother, and my conversation with her, where she said, if you win through domination, you've already lost,
mhm. Yeah.
right? And by
Can
that
I
sense,
interject
going
for
back,
just a minute?
sure,
And just to, because the thread of fatherhood is very real here for me, to say that the days that I experienced myself as a tyrant, there's so much shame because I know the truth of what I ought to do, and then action comes out, and there's this like, oh yeah, I just failed. I won that, but I actually lost.
yeah, 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 nicely, exactly. And I think there's a sense that, because somebody listening might be like, "What do you mean? What do you mean you lost? I mean, you got the kid to do what you wanted, right?"
Right.
But the consequence of that, of course, is the the fraying of the relationship,
Mhm.
and often because it creates resentment, pushback, the seeds of avenging, in the future, or whatever it is, right? Like,
Right.
if there's a winner, there's a loser.
Yeah.
And in terms of domination culture, we grew up, those in the West, especially, I think, have grown up with this as the model, that the way to defeat the bad guy is through force as power over, like an expression
Mhm.
of force. And we're actually, I maybe, even talk about like the police force, right? We literally call it the force,
Mhm.
right? And living in a place where the threat of violence, it kind of underpins everything.
Yeah.
So if you step out of line, right, it's like the repercussions often are some kind of violence or incarceration or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so it's punitive system. So the idea of moving in a different matrix is actually quite foreign to most folks who've never experienced it. And so, to go back to this idea of domination and partnership that, well, I guess I could say this: the skill set of partnership is often antithetical to the realities of trying to make it work in the culture as it is. And I mean, to say it more specifically,
Yeah.
like I remember when I had to take my son to school, and this is a couple years ago now, so he was a bit younger, but he was super resistant, didn't want to go, fighting it the whole time. I'm already pushing being late for my work. He's not doesn't want to put his shoes on. And I remember if I think of moments, I'm like, oh man, I kind of lost it there. Was just cracking under the weight of just like, what the fuck, get your shoes on.
Yeah.
Like this kind of, like, I couldn't hold it anymore, right? And
Yeah.
kind of like really losing it, and not overly over the top on him per se, but just me losing that sense of control.
Mhm.
And I realized, right, like if we were in a different system, and it's like, sure, school can wait, work can wait. It's like, this is more present. Like, this is actually what matters right now, because if I win through domination, I've already lost. Sure, I might get him to school, but I've done something to him and to our relationship
Yeah.
that causes damage, right? So I just say that, for any dads listening too, it's like, yeah, the reality is we don't have often, or don't feel we have, the time it takes to move from a relational way, right? Where if you really were like sitting with, okay, what is the resistance, son? Let's talk about it. Let's
Mhm.
go for a walk together. Let's, recalibrate our nervous systems together. Let's,
Yeah.
like, when in those moments of like, hey, we got to go, we're going to be late. It's very hard to pull that off. Or in a sense, yeah, like the curiosity to like really get into it. I just think that, and not so few models of it. I can think of a time when my dad and we got into something where, he blamed me for leaving the vehicle open. I was a teen at that point, maybe 16 or 17. But apparently I left the vehicle open after we DJ'd at night, and there was tons of his equipment in the vehicle.
Mm.
And in the morning, it was stolen. It seemed like it had been stolen. And, for me, I was like, I didn't leave the door open. I didn't check the doors. That I could have checked all of the doors. I was the last in the vehicle, but I could have checked other doors to make sure, but I didn't. I just locked my own.
Mhm.
And so his take on that was like, it was your responsibility because you were the last there. You should have checked the other doors.
Mhm.
And I just remember him being completely intolerant to any other possibility that I was wrong and I needed to take responsibility.
Yeah.
And I remember how much damage that did, actually, because I really resented him for that after, like, that there was no sense of like shared, oh man, like we both could have checked the doors, but we didn't. But also, my relationship matters more to me than some boxes of CDs, and a mixer.
Yeah.
But it was very much like, I'm right, you're wrong in this. You need to take accountability. But the fact that I can even remember that so specifically shows me how damaging those kinds of encounters can be
Yeah.
when they're not held well from a place of empathy and
Mhm.
connection
Yeah.
as the goal.
Right. To maybe balance the part of me that wants to get it all right with my kid. I remember one of your early interviews with is it Bio?
Bio. Yeah. Bio
Bio.
Komalafe.
I don't recall the name of the episode.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It said, Monsters in Perpetual Exile, I
Yeah.
believe.
So
It's a pretty good title, I thought.
it's a good title. And one of the things I picked up on there was he had spoken about not only like the acceptance of us damaging our kids, but almost like the necessity of it. Do you recall
Mhm.
that? It was
Yeah.
like he told a story about, I think, the father and son building something, and the father like says, "Go build that wall." He builds it, and then the father comes over and like smashes it down. It's a
Yeah.
metaphor for the way a son can experience a father's pushback. And the purpose of that story, as I understood it, was to say part of the reason, it's not what we're trying to damage our kids, but in the natural flow of life, it's going to happen. And how beautiful is that? Because then now he goes to tell the community, I have a wall that's smashed, and they can relate because they have something else that's chaotic or damaged. And
Mm.
suddenly there's new connection and there's new possibility for calling others to support him for the wall and them for their thing. And so I just want to bring that in because it was so
Yeah.
touching for me.
I could say, I think, a piece too, which, at least as I hear that now too, the interview was a while ago, but there's something in that for me, which is around, there's no possibility of village in perfection, right? And by that meaning, if you're fine on your own, and I even relating now to like, modern dominant culture, if you're fine on your own, like you can afford things, you can, exist, you can watch Netflix, you can, whatever, you can take care of what you need in a certain way and you don't, quote,
Mhm.
need anybody.
Yeah.
This again reminds me of Charles Eisenstein in Sacred Economics. If you don't need anybody, then there's no possibility of to village,
Mhm.
right? And I say that as a verb. And that true community on that understanding is only possible because you actually need other people,
Yeah.
right? Otherwise, like I did when I lived in the burbs, 12 or 13 years ago in a community complex, I would invite folks to potlucks.
Mhm.
At the time, I was like, well, what's one thing I can do to maybe build some community, meet some people? How do you meet your neighbors, right? Well, let's invite
Yeah.
them to potlucks. And a few folks came out, right? But it was always like a chore. It would always one thing on top of folks who would, you know, were busy and had other things to do and didn't want to.
Mhm.
You couldn't see the value beyond novelty, right? Like, oh, sure, it'd be cool to know a neighbor, but what for? That's so different than living in a culture where you actually need people, right?
Yeah.
And of course, I say this in quotations because we do actually need people to do lots of things. In particular, what I've come to understand is we need people to mark ritual moments in our lives,
Yeah.
right? Births, deaths, marriages, transitions, beginnings and endings of all kinds, stages of maturation, rites of passage, right? Like all of these things actually need people to pull off. But when you're in a culture which doesn't really do those things anymore, maybe a wedding. But I mean, this goes to my teacher, Stephen Jenkinson. He says most weddings are, you just call them celebrations of love, right? Like just high fives, because there's nothing much at stake in most modern weddings,
Yeah.
right? It's already determined, come here, say yes, and then, open bar.
Mhm.
That's a slightly different conversation. But I just go back to say that there's something necessary in being wounded in that way
Yeah.
so that village can appear.
Mhm.
And I think with parenting, it's interesting because I never really understood that from this layer until having a child. That village is a kind of a nice idea before you have kids,
Mm.
right? And I say village or even community or like basically a supportive network of some kind. It's
Mhm.
like a nice idea before having kids, and it's a necessity after having kids,
Yeah.
right? And again, I can understand why people who don't live near family or parents, or the grandparents of your kids, like I can understand why all of a sudden you're like, oh, we have to get closer to them because they're the
Yeah.
ones most willing. Well, not all the time, but often family's the most willing to actually take your kid for a couple hours so you can have a shower, clean some things up, get some work done. Whereas, that is a kind of a burden on most friends, if you call them that, right? Versus, living again in deeply embedded community where there's like collective tending of the children, for example,
Mhm.
as part of the way of being together, which is again a whole upgrade, which is quite rare for most people these days in modern society, but that I've been trying to cultivate alongside other aspects. But again, I just say that the true necessity and the function of other meaningful adults in the lives of your child
Mhm.
becomes very clear, I think, once the child is in your life and you seed out the consequence of the absence of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's something about like we just took a 1-week trip with my parents, so the grandparents, an aunt and uncle to my kids, and our family. And there were no other kids, 2 kids and all these adults. And
Mhm.
not that that's the perfect arrangement, but it showed me, it was like, oh my God, our nervous systems were completely relaxed because the moment that something was too much, that I experienced a child as a monster, there were all these other hands. There were all these other ways for me to step aside or be fully there because I knew in 20 minutes, someone else is going to jump in. And so it created this real net of not just safety, like it was psychological safety, and it was also permission to go with things more presently. And I mean, that's not our typical experience. So it was really lovely to tap into it. And certainly sad to leave that at the end as well.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think it benefits the kid, right? That they actually
Absolutely.
have all these like adults that are like, put me in, coach. The adults are ready to jump in and
Yeah.
because they're not part of the day to day grind, right?
Yeah.
That is so the truth for so many parents with young kids, especially.
Yeah. And there's something about this idea of if we riff a little bit on the monster has something for the community that's truly a gift to the community if it can be found. I'm going to go to the child context for a moment because this was advice that seems to be true in my experience that an acting out child needs responsibility. They need something to
Mm.
do that is inclusive, that they get to give to the family. And so, a great example of this, maybe a couple of weeks ago, my daughter's pissed at my son. She's the older one. She thinks she should have her way. She's not getting it. He's annoying her. I said, I need you to come in here and I need you to help me in the kitchen. She's
Mm.
like, okay. She comes in. 5 minutes later, she's completely regulated and she's doing like she's chopping, she's moving things in the kitchen. And it wasn't a forceful move on my part. It was more of an invitation. She took it and suddenly, like, it was so natural the way she came back into herself. So that
Mm.
part of her that was egoically attached to getting her way, it didn't have to be there anymore. And here she
Mm.
was giving to the family as part of a meal.
I mean, I love that story, and I think it highlights actually perhaps a deeper consequence of centering one's healing, right? That we have now in dominant culture.
Say
The
more.
personal
Yeah.
growth, yeah, the personal growth thing, where it's like you can always find more things to process, right? And when you center your own experience, perspective, emotional body, all that stuff. If you're in that ideology in a way, right, of like I need to process myself first, and like I need to figure myself out first, I think you miss something. You miss this possibility that it can get taken care of simply by participating,
Mhm.
right? Like something Stephen Jenkinson has said too around, again, the consequence of this idea of psychologizing everything and trying to fix from just the hyper focus on the thing. He's like, in village life, it's like, yeah, you can be stuck in your thing, but it's like, okay, you're still invited to the ceremony. There's still work to be done. There's preparations, there's beauty making. And
Yeah.
then a lot of stuff just naturally actually takes care of itself through
Right.
the intelligence of being part of something rather
Right.
than, thinking you got to fix it in isolation.
Yeah. And even remembering the body as part of that moving through an energy, like, oh, actually, if I'm in motion doing the dishes, something's going to move and I don't have to be in a therapy session. It's just I'm moving and it's here and that's okay. I want to say something about monsters, just a framework and see where we want to take it. And maybe we'll be wrapping our way to a closing soon. Something I came across a while back was a book called The Seven Basic Plots. And in this book, this gentleman, Christopher Booker, he lays out a framework that says basically all stories are about the overactive ego and what happens with that. Either happy ending is the overactive ego is somehow relaxed or vanquished. He's not distinguishing the hero versus the restorative story. And the tragic version is the overactive ego wins. And then it could be a death of some kind. I think Lord of the Flies is a good example. Black Swan, these are like tragic endings. And there were these timelines that he spoke to, these three kinds of monsters, and they have a past, present, and future orientation. And I'm curious how we might bring this into the child context. It's like the Avenger we've spoken about, the one who's considered like, I feel wronged for a past experience. Story would be, I could say, Freddy Krueger. He was a pedophile locked in a basement and burned. So here is just revenge, revenge over and over. The Holdfast is another one, and it's this kind of like Smog character from The Hobbit, the dragon that hoards the treasure, and it's so interested in the present. All I want is to keep what I have. I'm going to keep this treasure and I'm going to lie on it. And the last one is the Predator, which is future oriented, like Arnold Schwarzenegger and the Terminator. I'm going to go kill, timelines aside, I'm going to go kill Sarah Connor. That's all I'm about. And I say this because partly I'm going to own up to that the moments that I experience my kids as a monster, I start to take on monster energy within myself. And that is, we could call it dysregulation. But the times that I'm more tyrannical, I start to have my own attachments. And I feel, oh, you've just disturbed my peace. And I might be in revenge in that moment. Or you just broke my glass. And there's just something about this that what I'm really concerned about is some combination of the monster showing up in my kids, but it's more so sometimes that I just don't like feeling that I've become a monster.
Mhm.
Anything you want to go with from that?
I what's the word? I just had this thought or this phrase of monster transference.
Hmm. Yeah.
That's just that's what it came to me. This idea of they're dysregulated, they're being monstrous, and then I start getting agitated, then I get monstrous.
Mm.
There's something around that. It's almost like monstrousness is a field that can be, can expand and include, and I think that's true. And also, I see this lens of again, I'm not a neuroscience, aficionado or anything, but the sense of the regression through the brains, right? It feels almost like going back through the prefrontal cortex or whatever down to the reptilian, that it seems like those behaviors reside more in the reptilian, right? The sense of collapsing relationality into like subject object, right? And I mean, that can even be as nefarious as, the young man who goes into a mall and shoots it up, right? Like you can really see I think you can see this monstrousness born from the collapse of sovereign subjectivity of another person and others into simply an object of their own rage.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, empathy is nowhere, compassion is nowhere. It really, the other doesn't matter other than just simply a place to unload, literal bullets and rage in that sense. So in a much smaller category, like I do see that, there's that truth in the biology as well, that's there, right? In the human experience and the human wiring, that if I'm wronged, I want to lash out and wrong the other. Or if I'm perceived that they've wronged me, And so again, in some ways though, I wonder too about when is it appeals to reason and empathy for a young child brain, and when is other things required. And I'm not suggesting physical violence or anything, but it's just, I do wonder about those things, because I hear of like mama lions or whatever, I don't know, Papa Lion, whatever. It's like they grab the kid or whatever and like pin him down if he's causing trouble or something. Like there's a certain physicality that can be helpful, I think, when there's just zero appeals to the brain or to a sense of cognition and awareness.
Mhm.
And of course, there's just always a wider context generally that's happening, right?
Yeah.
What's the dynamic with the family ecosystem at that time? Is everybody else pretty regulated, or is there actually like a bubbling hangover from another fight that happened an hour before, or right? So it's this constant flux and dynamic that includes the individual child, of course, but they're embedded within the wider matrix of causality. So it's an incredible dance, to continually be with, really, and find that art, that skillfulness and again, not seek perfection, but, elegance of doing your best and then repair when it's necessary to.
Yeah. And maybe on the part of us that might be reaching for something. I mean, what came to me as you were speaking was the king archetype. The ways in which men, if we speak to fathers for a moment about the manhood part of being a father and how we might dance with that longing without perfection, that practice of allowing us to embody that crappy version of a father and repair, and then the tether or some of the anchors that we might have to keep moving towards as a practice. Anything you can offer there, either in your own practice or what you feel you're witnessing around men as fathers specifically?
Well, I mean, for me, when I think of the king, I think of generosity, right? That can go through, financial generosity or material generosity. But in this case, what I'm speaking to more is like generosity of spirit. And in that sense, a capacity to hold a compassionate and empathetic lens on, a relation to the other. And in this case, if it's a young child, for me, I feel most on point when, I'm regulated enough to be with whatever's present in my son from a place of resource and like self resource, which allows me to be generous with time, attention, care, in hold what could be in other circumstances quite dysregulating to me as well, but from a place of ease. And I remember sometimes too, he doesn't do this so much anymore. I think he's thankfully out of this territory of just like the tantrums, right? Where they'll just lose it for half hour, 45 minutes or whatever it is. And in those times as well, there's no reasoning. There's no appealing
It's just a ride.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's an orientation to those moments, I think, as a parent or as a father, when you're just accompanying them,
Mm.
right? You're not reacting. Typically, you're not reasoning, you're not reacting, you're not fleeing, but you're just being with.
Yeah.
And that's a very, I don't know, when I really sink into that too, it's a very touching stance as far as the medicine of parent or father, right? To be with and to hold a kind of generous container for the authenticity of that energy that wants to move, the distress that wants to express.
Yeah.
And so for me, again, when I think of the king archetype, even going forward, is to one, I mean, I would say for men, don't lose access to their own self-care practices,
Yeah.
right? That because it's so easy to, well, other kids, they're more important. I don't have time for that. But I do think it impacts your ability to be generous in relationality by not
Yeah.
upholding those practices and taking care of, the self so you are resourced enough. I think that's a big deal. And then, yeah, of course, being willing to not hold yourself to perfection, but the willingness to apologize, to repair when, you haven't been so hot.
Yeah.
And that will happen inevitably. And there's a certain humility there that I think is more trustworthy than trying to pretend that perfection is ever attainable.
Yeah. If you don't mind sharing, what are maybe one or two of your self-care practices that help you?
Yeah. I mean, I try to make a pretty consistent routine of working out, right, during the week. So there is
Mhm.
a sense of like, it's particularly at the end of the day after work, because I do a lot of computer work as well. And I know if I come home immediately after that, I'm not really fully present. I'm kind of tense and agitated.
Yeah.
And so having some practice with that, some physical movement, the place nearby us in our community, there's a men's sauna that we do once
Mm.
a week as well on the land there. That's, vital.
Mhm.
Um, breath work as well can be really beautiful, right? Just a simple practice of, 20 minutes, 30 minutes of breath work, end of the day or in the morning, things like that. I mean, and of course, like play, finding ways to play. Everybody's reality is perhaps somewhat different in terms of tensions of the amount of work that's needed, responsibilities, financial pressure,
Yeah.
right? All that stuff. And it feels like there is a requirement, I think, to also find the sweet spot of the balance between those things where, in terms of work, for example, and I fall into this, but more is not generally better. Like, there's
Mm.
always this threshold, I think, of productivity, right? Where it's like, if I just keep going now, it's actually diminishing returns
Yeah.
and my capacity limits. And I'm not actually that great at work anymore anyway. If I work a certain amount of hours, I have to like be willing to say, okay, enough,
Yeah.
and not hold myself to like, well, if I work a bit more, maybe I'll earn some more money for the family.
Yeah.
It's like have to again abide by a certain natural limitation of
Yeah.
capacity. Maybe it takes us back to near the beginning when we talked about what is evil or not, right? It's to
Mm.
abide by natural limit.
Yeah. I like hearing that in a self-care context as well. This is beautiful, Ian. I'm going to give you the last word. First, just thank you for joining me in this kind of exploration and wondering together. Anything you want to say that either you feel hasn't been said that should be said, or perhaps a parting wish, or both, especially for fathers listening?
Hmm. Well, I would just say, we're both connected, of course, through the Rad Dad initiative network as well. That fathering. I think it was Bio who said this too. Fathering is a community endeavor.
Mm.
Really, it's very difficult to father in isolation because of again your own need for perspective, support for what you're going through as a father, and it helps to have other father kind of figures or uncles in the life of your children as well, desperately so. And I'd also say in this leaning into village making, which many of us are wanting to do, I spent almost 10 years making a film about a community in Portugal called Tamera, which has been highly instructive. That film is called The Village of Lovers. But what I found was that in your children's lives, in terms of the initiatory moments that matter, right? There seems to be a particular coalescing around the shift from adolescence into some degree of maturity, usually 13, 14 often. And that the ability to pull off something like that, which can take the representation of a wilderness fast of some kind, being out in nature, that traditionally that was a part of the formula, right? It would be to bring these kids out in nature to have an encounter that can be actually quite traumatizing and should be traumatizing actually to their, younger egos,
Mm.
but held within a context of support, that helps make meaning of something like that so they can come back as responsible citizens to the world itself. Now, trying to get that off the ground when the kid is like 12 is unlikely to happen, right? Because you actually need, Stephen Jenkinson spoke at length about this, but he says, you are disqualified from your own child's initiation. Because you will circumvent, unconsciously or not, right, all of the attempts to actually them to go through this something. And that's normal, right? Because again, you care for them so much.
Yeah.
And so of course you don't want them to be subjected to something like this that is beyond anything they'd known before and an element of danger. But if you start when they're 12 to try to get the adults around them to help with that, or the men, chances are it's not going to happen because you don't have enough time in. They don't know your child very well, and it becomes like a weekend workshop, right? And so the invitation is you start with that understanding that day will come when they're 2, 3, 4, and onward. So by the time that magic threshold comes around, it's like you've got years in with these other adult figures, these other uncles, for example, that you trust and that your kid trusts to show up one day and bring him out to the forest for something significant to happen. So
Yeah.
I'll just say that to the fathers that, again, village making is a ongoing and disciplined long game
Yes.
rather than spontaneous event.
Nice. Is there anything you want people to know about, either ways to find you or things you have going on that you want to share project-wise?
Sure, absolutely. Folks are invited to check out The Mythic Masculine, of course, my podcast, which you named up front. We're coming up on 5 years this year, which is amazing.
Nice.
I've also got in-person events for men, ritual weekends, really, which explore primarily the archetype of the lover, which is a whole other conversation we could have perhaps in the future. But we do have myself and my collaborator, Deus Forte, we have our next online cohort for men of a program that weaves together elements of the lover, but also picks up where Iron John and the whole archetypal mythopoetic men scene seems to have left off. And we call that the deep masculine. And that begins September 26th for men to join from anywhere in the world. So yeah, if this is out in time, please feel free to check it out, themythicmasculine.com, and follow the links in the top header.
Sweet. Thank you so much, Ian. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate it.